G'day and welcome to the Bloody Aussie Battler podcast with your host and fellow battler Mike Holt. The Bloody Aussie Battler brings you news, views and interviews as we discuss what the liars, thieves, criminals and traitors have been doing to our country and to Western democracies around the world. My guests discuss important issues and explain why and how it's time to drain the billabong to bring back decent, lawful, moral government that will serve we, the people of the Commonwealth of Australia. Join us now on the Bloody Aussie Battler. Dick Yardley's book, Australian Political and Religious Leaders, Treason, Treachery and Sabotage. Dick exposes how Whitlam, Hawke, Keating, Goss, Rudd and all the other Fabians have destroyed our manufacturing and agriculture. If you want to know exactly how they have done it, get Dick's book at advanceaustralia.com.au and click on merchandise. Knowledge is power. Get the power to fight the corruption today.
Fiction meets science in a new podcast. Widdershins, time travel, cloning, aliens, telekinesis, robots, singularity, wormholes, space colonization, zombies. Starts 20 January 2020 on www.widdershinspodcast.com.
Well, g'day again, it's Mike Holt here, your Bloody Aussie Battler. And I'm talking to Darryl O'Brien, a good old Irish name there. Darryl, you've been working with Senator Rod Culleton, and as you know, we've spoken to Rod a couple of times here on the Battler, but you've been there right from the beginning and on the inside, and I believe you went over to London. So could you tell us a bit about your background first and then explain to us what you've been doing working with the Senator and I should say Senator in exile, and what you've done over in London and what's happened since then?
Yeah, g'day, Mike. I've been a bit of a political activist most of my adult years. I was always watching the politics here in Australia, state and federal, and wondering, can these people actually get away with what they're doing? I was also flabbergasted at the body language of wannabe politicians and how they were all full of energy to bring about changes and da-da-da. And then once they got into power, there was this about-face flip, and I was just, I couldn't believe how someone could just flip that easily. And I thought there's a lot more to this. What do they do to these people when they get into Parliament?
Yeah, that's often what puzzled me too, because they just change completely once they get in there. And I've always suspected that once they get into the Parliament House, they're taken into a room and said, well, these are the rules. Either you abide by the rules or else you're out.
That's right.
But I don't know if that happens.
And we don't know. We're left to speculate. And this is the sad thing. And I always sort of had political sight eventually to maybe one day get in there and actually find out what's going on. But I'm a plumber by trade, and I just predominantly do gutters and on domestic houses. And I was doing a lot of new houses, and back in about 99, I came across some people I was working for over in the western suburbs here in Melbourne, who had showed me this High Court case that was about taxation. And in that case, I think it was actually 2001, Mollica versus Chapman, and it was an admission in the court transcript from the Commissioner of Taxation, Michael Carmody, that the Australian Taxation Office does not legally exist. And I thought, wow, that was mind-blowing. So I very quickly went home and I wrote a letter to Michael Carmody. And it was a handwritten 2-page letter, because at that time I didn't have Microsoft Word available to me. I wasn't much of a computer buff. So I just wrote this handwritten letter, sent it to him, and I got a reply within a couple of weeks to my questions, which were, is it true that that you, being the Commissioner of Taxation, have admitted on the record, on oath, that the ATO doesn't legally exist? And the letter came back from one of their other officers from a Perth office on an ATO letterhead. Basically, it was a 2-page letter and admitted, yes, it is a fact that the ATO is not a legal entity. But that doesn't take it away from your obligations to pay tax under the Taxation Administration Act and all this sort of stuff. And I thought, well, yes, it does, actually.
Yeah, of course it does.
It does.
If an entity doesn't exist, how can we pay it?
Yeah, in fact, I'm actually committing an offence under the law by contracting with a non-entity.
Exactly.
And I thought, so I then filed a notice on the Commissioner, and the Commissioner's response was, oh, bugger you, mate, I'm going to throw you in court. And so they got me for non-payment of tax, failing to file a tax return. And I basically just went into that courtroom and just said, I do not consent to this jurisdiction. Now, I got a $250 fine. And there was a lady that was in the same, amongst the same group of people that were sort of doing this stuff. And she got a $550 fine for doing the same thing. And I thought, wow, if you were just to look at how much tax I pay each year, if I was just to go in every year to the courts and have a $250 fine applied against me for not paying tax, hey, I'm in front.
Yeah.
But I dug my heels in, because the court just said, oh, we're not taking any notice of that, there's the fine. So I took it to the next level, and I basically put the OPP, the Office of Public Prosecutions, on the spot, and I said, well, can you please show me that the ATO have the authority under the Constitution to impose tax? And they just said, oh, well, we're just upholding the court basically spoke for the prosecution. And she just said, well, you just got to pay your taxes. That's it, too bad. So I thought, oh, well, that's not getting much, not getting anywhere here. So I went downstairs to the registry and I said, well, can I have this matter appealed? And they said, no, you got to go to the Supreme Court. So I went round to the Supreme Court, had a chat with the prothonotary there. They said, no, you got to go to the Court of Appeals. All of this time, I actually, by the time, it took about half to 3/4 of an hour to do this process. I got round to the Court of Appeal, and the registrar just looked at me. I was in basically an empty office. And the registrar looked at me and said, can I help you, mate? And I said, yeah, I just want to appeal the matter out of the county court. And he just said, oh, you're the guy that's appealing, trying to appeal the tax case. He said, just pay your taxes, will you? And I was just, wow, flabbergasted. And I looked at, he gave me these forms, and it was going to cost me $3,600 just to appeal a case out of the county court. I thought, this is just a scam. This whole system is just they put a cash register up and say, now, if you want to do business in this court, and I thought, no, this is wrong. So the group that I was actually with was called Caledonia. And Caledonia had actually annexed all of Australia's national estate away from the Queen.
How did they do that?
Well, in 1992, James Renton, who was a barrister, he basically walked away from the legal profession here in Australia, and because he'd done his study, and he found that the Australian governments here in Australia, not only the federal but the states, had all lost the right to govern according to law. So he then looked for a remedy, and he found the only way in English law that he could to sort of bring them to account is to do what's called an annexation, which is it's a takeover of the national estate and of the body of law. And in order to do that, he needed to actually annex each and every parish, because Australia is made up of a series of parishes. And you see this especially in the titles office. So,
that's right, yes.
You'll have your title deed and it'll have the portfolio number, and it's in this particular parish, whatever that parish may be. So he drafted handwritten 10,000 pages, and he handed it up to Her Majesty through the Westminster Parliament, through a minister of the then government in 1992 in Northern Territory, Dennis Collins. And all the paperwork was handed up to Westminster, and according to the statute of limitations, the Westminster had 7 years for which to legally contest that annexation. So, of course, I think it was 2 years later, Queen Elizabeth, at her opening speech to the Chogham Conference, said, "I wish the secessionists of Australia well." And it was like,
whoa.
And I thought, wow, that's pretty powerful. So they can't do anything, basically. So they basically, then the clock was ticking. 7 years from, I think it was the 15th of June, 1992, fell due on the 16th of June, 1999. Now, funnily enough, wasn't that the last year where we had a referendum? And the question in that referendum, well, there were two, but the main question, the main thrust was, do you want to maintain the monarchy or do you want to go to a republic? And of course, Australia said, no, we'll stick with the monarchy, thanks. So that was held in November 1999, but it was too late. Job was done. You know, Australia's national estate was now, according to the annexation, was under the control of the principal in that annexation, which is an entity called Caledonia, which is a name that he had to apply to the annexation. And he extracted that name from one of the old northern or the Scottish tribes, a couple of thousand years ago. So that was a very interesting beginning for me in law. And from that point on, I realised that the annexation really wasn't going to take effect unless the Australian people had been made aware of it. So,
and how are we doing with that?
Well, it basically meant that I went out there and started conducting meetings. I created a group called the Community Law Resource Group.
Oh, yeah.
And I started that up with another chap from Caledonia. And our aim was to just teach the people of Australia the Constitution and just show them what the laws say and all this sort of stuff. And basically that led me then to eventually sitting in the office of Senator Rodney Culleton in 2016. And Rodney's was a chap that I'd been with law, Peter Gargan, and I'd met Peter probably a couple of years after the Caledonia stuff, and we'd sort of kept in contact, helping different people with different issues. And Peter had got the job first with Culleton, and then he called me in. And we saw the perfect opportunity with Rodney because he was fair income. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't compromised in any way. He was just a bloke off the street who has this incredible passion to make sure that everything is done right. You couldn't ask for a better entity to then present the law as it should have been and expose these people for their misbehaviour.
Yeah, well, that's come across very strongly. And, his performance in Parliament the day he challenged
George Brandis.
George Brandis, yeah. Yes. He, I think George Brandis was just so shocked. It was a pleasure to watch.
It was amazing. And
Senator Culleton.
Mr. President, just one question.
Order on both sides.
To the Senator, the Honourable George Brandis.
Just a moment. Order on both sides. Senator Culleton, start again.
Thank you, Mr. President. One question to the Senator, the Honourable George Brandis, QC, Attorney-General and Leader of the Government in the Senate. Since Senate School, it has come to my attention that there is a discrepancy between Section 33 of the High Court Act 1979, which says that all process shall, which must, be issued in the name of the Queen, and the High Court rules of 2004. If this appears to be the case, why has the High Court felt free to defy the Parliament for 12 years?
The Leader of the Government in the Senate, the Attorney-General, Senator Brandis.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Senator Culleton. Congratulations on your inaugural question in this chamber. I must confess, Senator Culleton, I wasn't expecting to be asked about the High Court rules, an object of some fascination to me, I might say.
On my left.
I will have a look at Section 33 of the High Court Act and whether or not it is apparent that there is an inconsistency, as you say, between Section 33 of the Act and the rules made under the High Court Act. As you would be aware, Senator Culleton, the rules of court are procedural rules. They attach forms, usually, that are used in the process of the court and the various procedural steps in proceedings before the court. I must confess it's never been drawn to my attention before that there may be an issue about the consistency between the High Court rules and Section 33 of the Act. But as I say, I'll look at the matter.
Thank you, Attorney-General.
Every day that I spent in that Parliament was just, our office was being overwhelmed with staffers from other senators and members of Parliament asking, wow, what does the Constitution say about this? Or what does the Constitution say about that?
These are the people who are supposedly governing us. They should know this.
This is what's, when I read, there was a very interesting, there's been 48 referendums in Australia since Federation. And
yeah, I thought it was only 44.
No, according to the AEC, and when you do the count on the AEC website, yeah, there's 48. The first one was in 1906, but you've also got to include the referendums that created the Constitution as well.
Ah, that's right.
Yeah. So this is what But in 1913, they had a very, very interesting referendum, and that was basically trying to empower the government to basically pass laws to do with corporations, without any restrictions, and they wanted to overcome monopolies. But when you read the yes and no questions, the yes and no arguments for that referendum, in there they actually said very clearly the Australian Constitution desperately needs the Australian people to understand it, because they are ultimately the supreme, absolute, uncontrollable authority. And as such, in order to properly instruct their representatives, they must have a good understanding of that Constitution, and that we must see that Constitution as just a bag of bones. It needs the people to put a body on it. It's just a bare frame. And what we've had since Federation is the system trying to take bones away. They desperately want to address it.
I just wanted to ask you there, is the CLRG still going?
A few years ago now, there was a lot of, because I was filling the room that I was hiring, a lot of people were saying, oh, you've got to be a bit more organised. And it's like, well, what do you want? And they said, oh, well, can you, incorporate it somehow? And I said, well, that's exactly what we don't want to do, because it's the corporate system that's causing all the grief. So, but they insisted, oh, well, okay, if you want to go down that path. So they then registered a name called the Community Law Resource Association with the Consumer Affairs in Victoria. And that then meant there had to be minutes of meetings and all the formalities that go with that. They had a vision of this, going, I'm not sure where, but I probably hung in there for probably another 12 months, and then I stepped away.
Well, the reason I ask, sorry to interrupt there, but the reason I ask is because we're going along the same path, actually, because we realise that the only way that we're going to get change in this country is if all the Australian people know our Constitution and know our rights and freedoms. And that can only be done through education. So I'm asking people around Australia now to set up Advance Australia discussion groups. And we're asking them to follow a set of guidelines that we've written, which includes writing minutes and all the rest of it. But there's a purpose behind it, because each group will be discussing the Constitution and English common law and all the other things that we need to know about. But those minutes then will be passed up to the central office here, and we will then disseminate them to the other groups to read, so that we're starting to exchange information, and the discussions in each group will help educate other groups. So it's purely for education rather than trying to organise to get a group going and blah, blah, blah. So what do you think of that idea?
Yeah, it's a good idea. I mean, we've got to really do whatever it takes to overcome the mass media's grip on the general public. I know the last 4 or 5 years I've been working with Know Your Rights. So we have a weekly radio program, and every Tuesday night, and we just spend 2 hours going through points of law and the like. And we do seminars all over the country. But we have to, because we've got social media, we've got internet-based media, we've got to just take advantage of that to the max and do whatever else it takes in order to overcome the Channel 7, 9 and 10 and ABC, because they are running a monopoly, and they have labelled us as sovereign citizens. But it's a good, every time they have a go at us, especially when they label us sovereign citizens, we then just hold up a mirror, because whatever they accuse us of, that's exactly what they are. Yeah. That's exactly what they are. They are sovereign citizens. They are ignoring and they're upholding an alternative to the law of the land. They are abusing the law of the land and trying to get everyone to believe what they're saying rather than what the law says.
Correct.
So we have an advantage in that sense.
Yeah. Actually, what I'm doing now too is anybody who's got a website can get that right to me and ask for the code, and they can then put our podcasts into their website. And, you know, so it makes it very easy. What we're trying to do now is to set up an alternative media network based on these podcasts and other things that we're doing. So, you know, this is, again, we're thinking along the same lines. If we can set that up, we can get around this media grip that they have, you know. So if anybody out there is listening and you want to put our podcast in your website, let me know. I'll give you the code. It's no problem. It's a very simple line of code, and away you go. Yeah.
So we just have to take advantage of every single opportunity there is to get the word out to, you know, whoever is willing to listen. And, you know, the key words, like what caught my attention was, well, the ATO doesn't legally exist. Well, gee, isn't that one of the best lures that you could possibly use to catch the majority of people out there, because we're all suffering over an overtaxed system. So
absolutely.
We've got enough key words.
Mate, I generally try and keep these podcasts to about 20 minutes. So we're getting fairly close to time. What we might do is we'll stop here, but in the next podcast, if you wouldn't mind doing it with me, we'll talk about your trip to England and the results of that and what's happening now. Okay?
Yeah, there's a lot to cover, and I'm condensing this down dramatically, but I urge people to look at the YouTube presentation of Rod Culleton's maiden question.
I'll put that on the website.
Yeah, that maiden question really put the whole system on notice, including, and when I say the whole system, I mean the court system, the parliament, and the executive. They were all put on notice from that one question. And that question was what Peter Gargan and myself in 2006, we actually put that into a writ against the Commonwealth, and we filed it in the county court here in Victoria. And we successfully sued. We charged the Australian government or the Commonwealth with attempting to pervert the course of power, the course of justice, because we highlighted the fact that there was no mention of the Queen in the High Court Rules 2004. And that was a perversion of the course of justice. So they didn't even come in and defend the case. We got an ex parte judgment in our favour, and we walked out of that courtroom. Thank you very much. Couldn't get out of the courthouse fast enough, actually. But we got, and then there was nothing done. So the system just went silent until Rod's maiden question, and then they were made to sit up and take notice because it was on the public record in the Senate.
Yeah, well, that put the cat amongst the pigeons. I was actually watching it on the video on YouTube, and I nearly fell out of my chair laughing. It was so good.
It was just brilliant. And Rod has such a way of presenting this stuff, and this is why the media just lapped him up. Yeah, they lapped him up because his language was just so out there, and people were just like glued to their radios and TVs listening to this guy, thinking, wow, this guy is just a breath of fresh air in the whole political environment here in Australia. And
yeah, well, what was so funny,
bus.
Brandis just didn't know what to say at first. He was flabbergasted. Did you see him? He was like a fish out of water.
Absolutely. Yeah. And Rod had a couple of senators come up to him at the end of that hearing and say, "What have you done? What have you done?" Well, gee, mate.
All right, Darryl, look, we'll stop here. All right, mate, thank you very much, and we'll be back very soon.
No worries.
I hope you enjoy listening to this and all my podcasts. The Bloody Aussie Battler podcast is just one of the things that I do to try and raise awareness of the massive fraud and treason that has been committed against us by the political parties. Back in 1967, I put my life on the line to protect our nation. I didn't do it so that a bunch of treasonous criminals could take over our government and steal everything from we, the people of the Commonwealth. So when I decided to do something to stop the treason and treachery, my skills from the Air Force were very handy. I run the Advance Australia HQ Group website, where we present a plan for the future. We can't get our country back without a plan. I also run the CIR Now website, where you will find heaps of useful information about the crimes and treason committed by the political parties. In addition, thousands of people have already signed the My Will letter to give a group of Commonwealth public officials the authority of the people to convene a grand jury. But we need many more signatures, so if you haven't signed yet, please do so. And ask your friends and family to sign too. Now, as you can imagine, all this takes a lot of my time and it costs money too. So if you could spare a gold coin or more to support my work, please go to any of these websites and click on the donate button. If you can, why not make it a monthly donation? Just the cost of a cup of coffee every month will help us keep on spreading the word. Thank you. Australia has a rich history. Unfortunately, most people today don't know much about it because the schools have stopped teaching it. So, sometimes at the end of my podcasts, I'm going to bring you a little bit of history. Now, many of us have heard of Breaker Morant, but this is his story told from another point of view. Now, the Breaker was executed by a British firing squad in Pretoria during the Boer War in South Africa, after being condemned to death for shooting prisoners of war while an officer in an independent company of mounted infantry. So the following account is quoted from Time Means Tucker by Duke Tritton. His informant was a man named Frank Farrell, and here's the story. Again, like Ben Bridge, he had been forced to witness the execution of Harry Morant. He said, "They marched every available Australian soldier into Pretoria and lined us up where we would have a grandstand view of how the British Army dealt with offenders against the rules of war. Harry refused to have his eyes bandaged and gave the order to fire himself. He stuck his chest out and said, 'Blast away, you bastards.' The only time the British Army showed any sense was the day they murdered Harry Morant. They disarmed us, and it was a week before we got our rifles back." He rose to his feet and walked away. An hour later he came back and unrolled his blankets and lay down. All the next day he was morose and had little to say. Don't ever let our Australian history die. If they don't teach it in school, get books and teach it to your kids. We have to pass down our rich history for future generations.